Welcome to week 2 of ENGL540. As in week 1, we will divide the presentation into a number of segments, 4 segments. I will start with a little bit of recap of what we talked about in week 1. This week I will explain the cover image I use for each week, the function rank matrix. So you will see how that is a very good map of the overall resources of the grammar or lexicogrammar of a language as precisely a resource for constructing meanings as wordings. But we'll come back to that. So the outline for today is the first segment, recap of week 1, the basic text and readings, a review of the location of lexicogrammar, the system of wording within language in context. Then segment 2 will take up another question about grammar, drawing on Halliday's 13 questions in his article about explanation. Why the, or why the so-called definite article in English. Then, having illustrated the way we can ask questions about the grammar and explain properties or features of the grammar, in the next segment, 2.3, I'll talk about strands of meaning in the clause. And that, of course, relates directly to the interpretation of the grammar as a resource for constructing meanings as wordings. And then finally, in segment 2.4, I will use the presentation of strands of meaning and intersect that with the compositional hierarchy relating to the units of the grammar to explain the function rank matrix, a schematic version of which, as I've said, appears as a cover image each week. Now remember, the basic text is just one book, your textbook, Deploying Functional Grammar. And in the study book and for each assignment, you have the details of what you need to read to be able to do the 3 assignments. Now this can be supplemented where needed in weekly folders. The supplements in the weekly folders are all optional, voluntary readings, just as suggestions if you want to deepen your knowledge of a particular area. And then in the e-library you have other optional readings, and they include a good introductory book for further consultation, Jeff Thompson's Introducing Functional Grammar, the 3rd edition, published in 2014, and then the book that is really the more in-depth reference source that Jeff's book was designed to be an introduction to, and that the Deploying Functional Grammar is a workbook for, Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar, or IFG for short. In your e-library you have the 4th edition of this, so revised by myself. We worked on the 3rd and the 4th editions. And of course, whenever you have a special interest to tell us about, let us know, because chances are that we can relate what you're learning in ENGL540 to your special interest. There may be educational, there may be healthcare, there may be administrative, legal, say tourism, any professional applications. Chances are that we can in one way or another relate the material that you're learning in ENGL540 to your interest beyond ENGL540, beyond the grammar as a resource for constructing meanings as wordings. And remember, each week you have material in the weekly folders. So you already have in week 1 PDF versions of the different segments of the presentation, and now also you have recorded versions. You have that from last year, and you have exercises, and you have some additional suggested readings, and the first weekly reading from your textbook from Deploying Functional Grammar. In the week 2 folder, so the folder of the week we're concerned with now, you have again suggested additional readings, voluntary. Coffin et al. Exploring English Grammar, we move from traditional to functional grammar. And then exercises, 3 word files with exercises and constituents in word classes. And then the relevant chapters from your textbook, Deploying Functional Grammar, chapters 1 and 2. Now let me continue. In a sense, this is a recap from what we talked about last week. But let me continue with the recap from last week. So a week ago, on the 20th of January, I talked about ENGL540. I won't repeat that now. We've covered that. But I will recap a little bit, review a little bit about approaches to grammar in general and the grammar of English. So we talked about traditional versus modern scientific. We talked about location of grammar as a resource within the totality of language and context. And I talked about asking questions about the grammar, explaining features of the grammar. And I used this schematic representation to show how far beyond traditional grammar we go in modern scientific approaches. Now, depending on the orientation in the modern scientific approach, different aspects of the grammar will be foregrounded. So in a formal grammar, the formal patterns of grammar would be foregrounded, but leaving out functional, meaning-oriented patterns very likely. But in a functional orientation of grammar, more specifically in systemic functional grammar, there are these different aspects of the grammar that become visible thanks to the theory. So the grammar is, among other things, clearly related to the levels or strata that form its neighborhood. To phonology, the clauses related to the tongue group, as we'll see. To semantics, we see the role of clauses relative to whole texts and parts of texts. Internal in the grammar, we posit groups and phrases between clauses, sentences, and words, and we recognize that words actually consist of morphemes. We view the grammar not only as structure, but as system, as choices in the construction of meaning as wordings. So as a potential for making meaning. And related to this motif of making meaning, we recognize the functional organization of the grammar, that the grammar is inherently organized in functional terms. It is organized according to the functions that it is evolved to serve over thousands upon thousands of generations of speakers or language users. So the major systems we'll be looking at are the systems of the clause, textual theme, interpersonal mood, experiential transitivity, and I'll work my way up to a map of this in the form of a function rank matrix in the final segment of today. That means that we also look at text in these functional terms and the analog, the units in the text that the clause realizes, expresses, the meanings that it constructs as wordings can be differentiated, again functionally. So textually as message, interpersonally as move, and experientially as figure. And then logically, the logical semantic relations are used to combine clauses. Again, this is just preview of coming interactions. So as a reminder, we looked at this last week. Halliday says about the organization of language, he says, having talked about semiotic systems or systems of meaning in general. Now, one special kind of semiotic system is one that has a grammar in it. Such a system means in 2 phases, have a distinct phase of wording serving as a base for the construction of meaning. In other words, its content plane, shown here in yellow, contains a grammar or lexicogrammar as well as a semantics. In this figure in green, you have the context, the semiotic environment of language. And as I've said before, we approach language in general and grammar specifically ecologically. We look at it in its environment. And in blue here, you have the expression plane in spoken language, phonology, and phonetics. So this sense of the organization, overall organization, the global organization of language as consisting of content and expression, operating with context, viewed within ecologically within context, is central to the understanding of the organization of language as a resource. And again, to pick up on Halliday's point, if we look at language as a particularly powerful kind of semiotic system of meaning, we see that both content and expression are further organized internally into levels or layers or strata. So content is organized again into semantics and lexicogrammar. As Halliday put it, we mean in two phases. And similarly, expression in spoken language into two levels or strata, phonology and phonetics. So we understand both semantics and lexicogrammar, of course, in relation to their contribution in the construction of content. So a simple system like a child's proto-language is just content expression, but post-infancy adult languages are further stratified, and that is what gives them the additional power to make meaning. So we talked about the stratal planes. Context, the semiotic environment of language. Semantics and lexicogrammar, the content plane. And phonology and phonetics add to the content plane as the expression plane. And in written language, this will be graphology and graphetics. Now, each level or stratum has the largest units, the most extensive unit of patterning. But they differ from one stratum or one level to another. So when we look at context, it's a context of situation. You could think of it the context of use or communication on any one given occasion. When we turn to semantics, it's a discourse, a text that operates in that context of situation. In fact, we define text or discourse as language functioning in context. So a text could in fact be minimal, as in tweets, traffic signs, telegrams, or very extended, as say in a whole course over a semester, or a long novel, or a long, say, film like Lawrence of Arabia. It really depends on the context. In grammar, the most extensive unit is a clause. And clause, of course, consists of other units, as we'll see. It consists of groups and phrases. Groups consist of words, and words are morphemes. We'll come back to that. When we move into the phonology, again, there is a different unit, and the most extensive units of phonological patterning of sound, is a tone group. Let me illustrate this. And I illustrate it with reference to a context of situation, a medical consultation. And this is just hinted at by the photograph above, or the screen capture. You have a doctor and a patient, and the patient has come see the doctor to consult about some medical problem. That's the context. Medical consultation, professional, and so on. Then within that, you have the basic units of language. In semantics, you have the discourse or text. In lexicogrammar, clause, and tone group within phonology. So just to give you a hint of what this might look like in terms of the analysis. This is the analysis of a long passage of the medical consultation. And here I've analyzed it in terms of rhetorical relations, the rhetorical relations or logical semantic relations that are used to develop the medical consultation as a text from beginning, continuing, expanding to the end. In the grammar then, you focus on clauses and combinations of clauses. So they tend to be, typically a clause is a smaller unit than the text. But the primary consideration is it's a unit of wording rather than a unit of meaning. So if you just take one fragment from the whole text, from the whole unit of meaning, we can look at the clauses here. And it's a combination of two clauses. The doctor asks the patient, what happens when you take penicillin? What happens when you take penicillin? That's a combination of two clauses, and each clause is organized internally, as I already hinted, and we'll see in much more detail later, functionally. So there are different functional layers, different strands of meaning within each clause. And for most of the semester, we'll be concerned precisely with these different layers of functional organization, so that we bring out the nature of the clause as a resource in the construction of meaning. And this combination of two clauses, in this particular case, happens to be one tone group. As the doctor says, what happens when you take penicillin? The double slashes angled indicate boundaries between tone groups. So boundaries between tone groups are phonological boundaries. Tone groups are phonological units, in contrast with clauses, which are grammatical units. And in this particular case, two clauses combined, what happens, and a temporal qualification when you take penicillin, are expressed, realized, spoken as a single tone group. And the two here means that it's spoken on a rising tone. So on penicillin, the doctor rises. And then the patient answers, well, it's so long ago, that's a tone 4, which means falling, rising, and so on. Now, this is just a very schematic illustration. The point I want to make is when we look at the overall patterns of language and context, we'll find that the different levels, the different strata, all have different patterns, different units. Now, we will, of course, focus on the analysis, the description and analysis of the lexicogrammar, but we'll always do this grounding it in relation to both semantics and, where appropriate, phonology. So the main focus in ENGL540 naturally is lexicogrammar, but we'll always look at lexicogrammar in relation to, in the first instance, semantics. So clause in relation to text, the contribution it makes in text, the way it's influenced by its part in the development of text, and where appropriate also in reference to phonology, as I just hinted at. If you're doing ENGL 519, I would expect you, of course, to focus on text or discourse, so the level of semantics in relation to context. So that's the motivation behind our focus on the functional or metafunctional organization of the resources of the grammar and the interpretation of the corresponding unit in the semantics. Units within the text, within the basic unit or most extensive units of meaning, text, message, move, and figure realized as a clause. Now let me say something about exercises that were added for week 2. I'll have a Kahoot on this, as well. I leave you to do the exercises on your own. They're voluntary. You won't be tested on them in the assignments, in the first assignment, but it's a way for you to find out how much you retain from whatever you've learned about constituency in the grammar, and in particular word classes, and also then by implication class of groups and phrases. So there's a sequence of 3 related exercises having to do with constituency and word classes. There are 2 tasks. That's in the first one, task 1. Then the second task builds on that and also includes a key to task 1. And the third one is a key to task 2. So that's a document that looks like this. Now, since this exercise is centrally concerned with classes or words, let me say a little bit about word classes. And that takes us back then to something that was very much at the forefront of the traditional accounts of grammar in the Western tradition, where, as I said yesterday always means the last time we met. The model is one of words in clauses or words in sentences. So a lot of burden in the description was placed on the classification of words into different word classes, or as they also called parts of speech. What are the word classes? I mean, this still we will revise, but retain. What are the word classes that we will be working with? Well, they include the word classes you recognize from traditional descriptions, more or less. Noun, adjective, numeral, determiner, verb, preposition, adverb, conjunction. But then can be grouped on a functional basis into very broad superclasses. So noun, adjective, numeral, determiner into nominal words, verb and preposition into verbal words. Note that prepositions are in fact verbal words. That may in fact be even clearer or more obvious in Chinese. And in Chinese, a term in description of Chinese grammar, instead of preposition, often the term co-verb is used. So if you take an item like 在, for example, it's used both analogously to preposition in English and also as a full verb. And then adverbials, adverbs and conjunctions, and the different conjunctive word classes. I've given you some illustrations here of word classes. So nouns, for example, taking the classification one step further in detail or delicacy, common, proper, and pronouns. So common, country, pyramid, for example, common ones. Proper, Guatemala, pronouns, it, they, he, she, it, I, you, we, and so on. Adjectives, for example, ancient, present day. Adjectives name the qualities of time periods or of regions, western, southern. Determiners, the best known ones are the so-called articles from traditional grammar, the definite article the and the indefinite an, but they're in fact just a couple of members of the more general class of determiners. And then the verbs, lexical, for example, live, hate, break, work. Auxiliaries, say of time, voice, be, have. And the finite ones that can only function as temporal modal, for example, will, can, may, might, shall, should, must. And the prepositions, which are really like small verbs, in, on, at. Adverbs, gradually, today, where, when, how. Conjunctions like linkers and or but, binders, when, while, although, if. And non-structural cohesive ones like however, nevertheless, for example, meanwhile, furthermore. And continuatives like well, or, yes, no, serving continuative functions. And you remember there's been a long history of the classification of words in the Western tradition I showed you this magnified. If you'd like to read about it, as an interesting historical account by a British linguist, R.H. Robins, who came to specialize in the history of Western linguistics. Now, when you do the exercise, remember that in terms of recognizing word classes and determining them, you can actually get help from dictionaries. So, of course, you've been using dictionaries for a long time and you're expert dictionary users. But you can use this exercise. You can use this exercise to just determine again how much information you can get from a dictionary. So if you take this example, it comes from a text that's part of the exercise. The ancient Mayas lived in present-day southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and western El Salvador. Then if you're interested in finding out what present day is, you look it up in dictionary and you'll find that even though you could think of it as a noun, it has an adjective function in the sense of relating to the current period of time. And then you can look at the examples given in the dictionary, as in this case, present day technological developments, and you can check them against the text passage you're trying to analyze. And similarly here with Western, you look it up in dictionary and you'll get something like this. Adjective, two different senses, situated in the West or directed towards or facing West. There will be shahs in some Western areas. Well, that seems to match Western El Salvador. There's another sense, Western living or in originating from the West, but that matches the example we're analyzing less well. And then there is a noun, a film, television drama, or novel about cowboys in Western North America, set especially in the 19th century, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Well, that's ultimately related but different sense of Western. And this Western is noun rather than adjective. So that's the way in which you can use the dictionary as a reference source when you check the classification of words. So you check them looking up the entry, the sub-entries, and the sub-entries with the glosses relating to the different word classes that are listed for the words in the entries. In this case, adjective, you can match that to the classification that I showed you before. So if you go through this whole example, the is a determiner, ancient adjective, Mayas noun, lived verb, in preposition, present day adjective, southern adjective, Mexico noun, Guatemala noun, Honduras noun, and conjunction, western adjective, El Salvador noun. Now in the exercise, you'll be asked to do this in task 1 for a few more clauses, and then in task 2, building on what you've looked up in the dictionary or determined without looking up in the dictionary, you'll be asked to think about class of groups. So for example, the ancient Mayas, that has a noun, an adjective, and determiner. These are all nominal words and they form a nominal group. Lived, a verb, a single verb, but it forms a verbal group. And in present day southern Mexico, a prepositional phrase. We'll talk more about groups and phrases, but this is a warm-up for the recognition that words don't function directly in clauses, but they function organically as parts of groups, phrases. So here's another example. And just a reminder that if you focus on words, as traditional grammarians did, you relate them not directly to clauses, but via groups to clauses. And you also recognize that words, in turn, in a language like English, consist of other grammatical units, morphemes. So if you take this example, which comes from a traditional folktale, gentle breezes blew over the Nile. You can classify the words gentle, adjective, breezes, noun, blew, verb, over, preposition, the Nile, the determiner, Nile, noun. And you could further go into the internal structure of the words, like breeze, breezes. So breeze consists of the noun breeze and then a plural suffix z. But you have to look at this in relation to the overall organization of the composition of the grammar: clause, group or group phrase, morpheme, word morpheme. And you can familiarize yourself with the relation of this to the classification of different word classes. Now the next stage will be to focus on one of them, one of the words, one of the word classes, specifically a definite or specific determiner, the. And we look at Halliday's question, why the? You could say, why are speakers of English so fond of or obsessed with the? End of segment 1. Thank you.